Picture this. You're a 15-year-old girl in a small village on the Mongolian steppes in 1220, and you hear the thunder of 1,000 horses approaching. Your father grabs your hand and whispers the words that will haunt you forever. Hide, or they'll take you to serve the Khan. But there is nowhere to hide when the Mongol Empire comes calling. Before diving into this haunting tale of power and exploitation, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these disturbing historical stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about humanity's darkest chapters. The year was 1220, and Genghis Khan's empire was expanding at a rate never seen before or since in human history. But alongside the conquest of territories came another, more sinister collection, the systematic gathering of young women to serve in the Khan's court. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic exploitation. It was an organized system as methodical and ruthless as the Mongol military machine itself. The Mongols called it jasog, a tribute system that demanded not just gold, livestock, and weapons, but human beings. Every conquered territory was required to provide a quota of their most beautiful young women, typically between the ages of 13 and 16. These weren't volunteers or political marriages between equals. They were captives, torn from their families and communities to satisfy the desires of an empire built on conquest. The selection process was both brutal and bureaucratic. Mongol officials would arrive in conquered territories with detailed instructions about what they were looking for. Beauty was important, but it wasn't the only criterion. They sought young women who showed signs of intelligence, who came from respectable families, and who possessed skills like weaving, cooking, or playing musical instruments. The irony was devastating. The very qualities that made these girls valuable to their communities also made them targets for imperial exploitation. Local officials, desperate to avoid the wrath of Mongol administrators, would often conduct their own preliminary selections, gathering groups of eligible young women for inspection. Imagine being a parent in one of these communities, knowing that your daughter's beauty and talents, which should have been sources of pride, had instead painted a target on her back. The inspection process itself was dehumanizing in the extreme. Young women would be lined up like livestock at a market, their physical attributes evaluated, their backgrounds investigated, their potential usefulness assessed. Those who passed this initial screening would be separated from their families immediately. There were no goodbyes, no time to pack belongings, no promises of future contact. The empire had claimed them, and they belonged to it now. Once selected, these young women faced a journey that would strip away everything they had ever known. They were organized into caravans under heavy guard, not to protect them from outside threats, but to prevent escape. The distances were vast. Girls captured from Chinese territories might travel for months across the steppes to reach the Khan's court, while those taken from Central Asian cities would endure different but equally grueling routes. The psychological impact of this journey cannot be overstated. These were teenage girls who had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplaces, suddenly forced to march across continents toward an uncertain fate. They spoke different languages, came from different cultures, and had different religious beliefs, but they shared a common terror about what awaited them. The guards who supervised these caravans were often themselves products of the Mongol system, captured soldiers or administrators who had been absorbed into the imperial structure. Some showed traces of compassion toward their charges, understanding that they too had once been prisoners of the empire. Others, perhaps trying to prove their loyalty to their new masters, treated the girls with deliberate cruelty, seeing kindness as a weakness that might be reported back to their superiors. During the journey, the girls began to learn the harsh realities of their new existence. They were given basic instruction in Mongol customs, taught a few essential phrases in Mongolian, and warned about the punishments that awaited those who failed to please their imperial masters. These weren't educational sessions, they were survival training for a world where the smallest mistake could mean death. Food was often scarce, shelter was minimal, and medical care was non existent. Girls who fell ill were left behind, either to die or to fend for themselves in hostile territory. Those who showed signs of resistance were made examples of in front of the others. The message was clear: comply or perish. The physical hardships of the journey were matched by psychological warfare designed to break the spirits of these young captives. They were told that their families had forgotten them, that their home communities had celebrated their departure, that they were lucky to be chosen for such an honor. Every lie was calculated to sever their emotional connections to their former lives and make them more dependent on their captors. When these caravans finally reached their destination, the survivors found themselves in a world that was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. The Khan's court was a mobile city, capable of housing thousands of people and moving across the steppes with the seasons. The wealth on display was beyond anything these young women could have imagined. Silk from China, gold from conquered kingdoms, precious stones from across the known world. But beneath the luxury lay a system of control so comprehensive that it made escape not just difficult, but literally unthinkable. The Khan's residential compound was divided into multiple sections, each with its own hierarchy, its own rules, and its own forms of surveillance. The newest arrivals were housed in the outermost rings, where they could be watched constantly and where any attempt to flee would be immediately detected. The teenage concubines were not the only women in the Khan's court. There were also the wives of Mongol nobles, female servants of various ranks, and women who had earned elevated positions through years of service or particular skills. This created a complex social structure where the newest arrivals were at the very bottom, vulnerable to exploitation, not just from male officials, but from other women who had internalized the system's values. Upon arrival, each girl was assigned to an experienced woman who would serve as her mentor and supervisor. These mentors had once been teenage captives themselves, but years in the system had transformed them into enforcers of imperial will. They taught the newcomers how to dress, how to speak, how to move, and most importantly, how to anticipate and satisfy the desires of their masters. The training process was comprehensive and designed to erase every trace of the girls' original identities. Their names were changed to Mongolian versions. Their hair was styled in Mongol fashion. They were given new clothes that marked their status and role. They were taught to worship Mongol deities and to participate in Mongol ceremonies. Every aspect of their former selves was systematically replaced with something that served the empire's purposes. Language instruction was particularly crucial, as the girls needed to understand not just basic commands, but the subtle nuances of court politics. A misunderstood phrase or an inappropriate response could have deadly consequences. They learned to read the moods of their superiors, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, and to make themselves invisible when their presence was not desired. Within the Khan's household, the concubines existed in a carefully structured hierarchy that determined everything from their living conditions to their daily responsibilities. At the top were the women who had borne children to the Khan. Their status as mothers of potential heirs gave them a measure of protection and influence that others could only dream of. Below them were the long-term favorites who had managed to maintain the Khan's interest through a combination of beauty, intelligence, and careful political maneuvering. The newest arrivals occupied the lowest rungs of this ladder, and their lives were marked by constant uncertainty and fear. They might be called to serve at any moment for any purpose, with no advance warning and no ability to refuse. Some were assigned to household duties, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the elaborate textiles that decorated the royal quarters. Others were designated for entertainment, singing, dancing, playing musical instruments, or simply providing companionship during the Khan's leisure hours. But the most terrifying assignments were those that took place in the Khan's private chambers. These teenage girls, many of whom had never been alone with a man outside their immediate family, were expected to provide intimate services to one of the most powerful and violent men in human history. The psychological trauma of these encounters was compounded by the knowledge that their performance would be evaluated, reported on, and could determine their future survival. The Khan himself was not the only man these girls might be required to serve. Mongol culture permitted the sharing of concubines among male relatives and trusted generals, meaning that a teenage girl might find herself passed from one powerful man to another, like a piece of property. Each new assignment brought fresh terrors, as different men had different preferences, different tempers, and different levels of cruelty. Competition among the concubines was fierce and often deadly. In an environment where favor could mean the difference between life and death, young women who should have been supporting each other instead became rivals and sometimes enemies. Some attempted to sabotage their competitors, spreading rumors or creating situations that would make others look bad. This competition was deliberately fostered by the Khan's administrators, who understood that women focused on fighting each other were less likely to unite against the system that oppressed them all. The isolation experienced by these young women was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of their situation. Cut off from their families, their communities, and their cultures, they had no one to turn to for emotional support. The other concubines were potential rivals. The supervisors were enforcers of the system. The Khan and his associates saw them as objects for gratification. In a court filled with thousands of people, each girl was utterly alone. The Mongol system was designed to discourage resistance through a combination of severe punishments and carefully crafted hopelessness. Examples of what happened to those who defied the Khan's will were made public and deliberately shocking, ensuring that every person in the court understood the consequences of disobedience. Physical punishments for concubines who displeased their masters could be savage. Beatings were common, but the Mongols had developed more creative forms of torture that would leave lasting scars while keeping the victim alive. Some girls who attempted to escape were brought back and publicly flogged, then forced to serve in the most degrading positions as a warning to others. Those who continued to resist might find themselves given to the lowest ranking soldiers as a form of collective punishment. But perhaps more effective than physical torture was the psychological warfare employed to break the spirits of potential rebels. The Khan's administrators were experts at identifying girls who retained hope of escape or rescue, and they systematically destroyed that hope through carefully orchestrated cruelties. A girl who refused to comply might be told that her family had been executed as punishment for her disobedience. Another might be shown fake evidence that her parents had sold her willingly and were celebrating their newfound wealth. The most heartbreaking cases were those involving girls who had managed to form friendships with other concubines. When one girl showed signs of resistance, her friends might be punished instead, creating a situation where defiance meant not just risking your own life, but the lives of the only people in the world who still cared about you. This technique was devastatingly effective at preventing any form of organized resistance. Some girls attempted to end their own lives rather than continue in their captivity, But even this final act of defiance was anticipated and prevented when possible. Guards were trained to watch for signs of despair, and potential methods of suicide were carefully controlled. Girls who made unsuccessful attempts were kept under constant surveillance and often assigned to even more degrading duties as punishment. The few who did manage to escape faced almost insurmountable challenges. The Khan's court was constantly moving, making it difficult to develop geographical knowledge that might aid in flight. The surrounding territories were controlled by Mongol forces who would return escapees for rewards. Most devastating of all, the girls had nowhere to go. Their home communities were often hundreds or thousands of miles away, and even if they could somehow reach them, they might find their families dead, their villages destroyed, or their former neighbors unwilling to risk Mongol revenge by harboring escaped concubines. The systematic erasure of identity was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the concubine system. These young women arrived at court with names, histories, beliefs, dreams, and connections to families and communities. The Mongol system methodically destroyed all of these, replacing them with a manufactured identity designed solely to serve imperial purposes. The process began with the changing of names. A girl named after a flower in her native language might be rechristened with a Mongolian name, meaning obedient or beautiful. This wasn't just administrative convenience, it was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. Every time she heard her new name, she was reminded that her original self no longer existed. Religious conversion was another tool of identity destruction. Girls who had grown up Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, or following traditional local beliefs were forced to participate in Mongol shamanic rituals. They were required to make offerings to Mongol spirits, to participate in ceremonies honoring Mongol ancestors, and to abandon the religious practices that had connected them to their families and communities. Language suppression was equally systematic. While the girls needed to learn Mongolian to survive, they were often forbidden from speaking their native languages, even among themselves. Guards were specifically instructed to listen for conversations in foreign tongues and to punish anyone caught using their original language. Over time, many girls found their ability to speak their mother tongue fading, along with their memories of the stories, songs, and cultural knowledge those languages carried. The clothing and personal decoration imposed on the concubines served similar purposes. Traditional dress from their home cultures was replaced with Mongol styles that marked their status and role. Their hair was arranged in ways that would have been foreign or even shameful in their original communities. They were required to wear jewelry and ornaments that proclaimed their ownership by the Khan. Perhaps most tragically, many of the girls gradually internalized these changes. Faced with the impossibility of returning to their former lives and the daily necessity of survival, some began to identify with their captors and to see their original identities as embarrassing reminders of a lower status. This psychological adaptation was a survival mechanism, but it also represented the final victory of the system over its victims. The concubine system didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of Mongol society that normalized the commodification of human beings and the use of sexual violence as a tool of conquest. The impact extended far beyond the women directly involved, shaping the entire social structure of the Mongol Empire. For Mongol men, the system created a culture where women were viewed primarily as rewards for military service and symbols of status. Young warriors were promised access to beautiful captives if they distinguished themselves in battle. Commanders used concubines as gifts to reward loyal subordinates or to seal political alliances. This commodification of women became so normalized that it was integrated into the empire's economic and political structures. The children born from these relationships occupied a complex position in Mongol society. While some children of concubines could rise to positions of power if they showed ability, and their mothers retained favor, others lived in a liminal state, neither fully legitimate heirs nor ordinary subjects. These children often grew up witnessing the treatment of their mothers and other women, normalizing patterns of domination and exploitation that would continue into the next generation. The psychological impact on Mongol women who were not concubines was also significant. The wives of Mongol nobles and administrators lived with the constant knowledge that their husbands maintained harems of young captives. This created an atmosphere of competition and insecurity that poisoned family relationships and made genuine intimacy difficult. Some Mongol women dealt with this situation by becoming complicit in the system, supervising concubines, or even participating in their selection and training. The presence of thousands of foreign concubines in the Mongol court also had cultural consequences. These women brought knowledge of different languages, customs, arts, and technologies, contributing to the cosmopolitan character of the Mongol Empire. But this cultural exchange came at an enormous human cost, as the knowledge was extracted from people who had been violently separated from the communities where that knowledge had developed. The Mongol concubine system was part of a larger international network that treated young women as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded across vast distances. This wasn't just about satisfying the personal desires of Mongol leaders, it was about demonstrating power, building political relationships, and maintaining the complex web of loyalties that held the empire together. Mongol administrators developed sophisticated methods for evaluating and categorizing the women they collected. Different regions were known for producing women with particular characteristics. Chinese territories might be expected to provide girls skilled in music and poetry, while Central Asian regions were valued for women trained in textile work and household management. This geographical specialization meant that the trauma of separation was compounded by cultural displacement, as girls found themselves in courts where their particular skills and backgrounds made them exotic curiosities rather than respected individuals. The logistics of transporting thousands of young women across the Mongol Empire required an extensive infrastructure. Specialized caravans were organized with guards, supplies, and route planning. Way stations were established where the captives could be housed temporarily. Administrative systems tracked the movement of human cargo with the same efficiency used for military supplies or trade goods. The economic value placed on these women was calculated with brutal precision. A particularly beautiful or skilled girl might be worth several horses or a significant quantity of precious metals. This commodification extended to every aspect of their existence: their training, their maintenance, their productive capacity, and even their reproductive potential were all factored into economic calculations. Some of these women were used as diplomatic gifts, sent to foreign courts as gestures of friendship or tokens of alliance. A Chinese princess might find herself presented to a Persian ruler, while a Central Asian girl might be gifted to a European delegation. These diplomatic exchanges spread the trauma of the system beyond the Mongol Empire itself, normalizing the use of human beings as political instruments throughout the known world. For those who survived the initial shock of capture and transportation, life in the Mongol court became an endless cycle of adaptation and survival. The psychological coping mechanisms these young women developed were both remarkable testaments to human resilience and tragic examples of how people can be forced to accommodate themselves to the most horrific circumstances. Some girls found ways to make themselves indispensable through practical skills. Those who could cook, sew, or provide medical care sometimes found more stable positions that offered a degree of protection from the worst abuses. Others discovered that they could gain favor through entertainment, singing, dancing, or storytelling that reminded the Khan of the conquered territories and peoples that now belonged to him. The most successful survivors often developed what modern psychologists would recognize as complex survival strategies. They learned to read the emotional states of their captors with extraordinary precision, anticipating needs and desires before they were expressed. They became experts at making themselves seem grateful and willing, even when experiencing internal horror and revulsion. They developed the ability to dissociate mentally during traumatic experiences, preserving some core sense of self while allowing their bodies to be used. Friendships between concubines, when they could be maintained despite the competitive atmosphere, became lifelines that helped preserve sanity and humanity. These relationships had to be conducted in secret, as administrators feared that emotional bonds between captives might lead to coordinated resistance. But in whispered conversations during brief moments of privacy, young women shared memories of home, provided emotional support during particularly difficult periods, and maintained connections to their original identities. Some found solace in maintaining private religious or cultural practices, even when public observance was forbidden. A girl might secretly recite prayers learned in childhood, practice traditional songs in her head, or maintain mental calendars based on festivals from her homeland. These private acts of resistance were small, but crucial ways of preserving something authentic in a world designed to erase their individuality. The development of mentor relationships with older concubines was another survival strategy. Though these relationships were complicated by the power dynamics within the system, an experienced woman who took a younger girl under her protection might genuinely care about her welfare, but she was also an enforcer of the system's rules and expectations. These mentorships often involved painful lessons about how to survive abuse while maintaining enough spirit to continue living. One of the most complex aspects of the concubine system was what happened when these teenage captives became pregnant. Pregnancy could dramatically alter a girl's status within the court hierarchy, but it also introduced new forms of vulnerability and trauma. A concubine who bore a son to the Khan or one of his relatives might find herself elevated to a position of relative security as the mother of a potential heir. However, this protection was contingent on the child's continued health and the father's continued interest. If the child died or fell out of favor, the mother might find herself returned to her previous vulnerable status, or even executed to eliminate a potential source of political complications. The experience of motherhood under these circumstances was profoundly distorted. These were teenage girls, often still children themselves, who had been violently separated from their own mothers and communities. Now they were expected to raise children in an environment where love and attachment were dangerous luxuries. They had to teach their children to navigate the same system that had traumatized them, preparing them for lives where survival depended on pleasing violent and unpredictable masters. Many of these children grew up with complex relationships to their own identities. They were simultaneously privileged as members of the imperial family and stigmatized as the offspring of captives. Their mothers' traumatic histories became part of their own psychological inheritance, even when those histories were deliberately obscured or rewritten. Some children of concubines became important figures in Mongol politics and administration. However, their success often required them to distance themselves from their mother's experiences and to embrace the system that had victimized the women who gave birth to them. This created intergenerational trauma patterns that extended the psychological damage of the concubine system far beyond its direct victims. The girls who bore daughters faced different but equally complex challenges. Daughters of concubines might eventually become concubines themselves, continuing the cycle of exploitation into the next generation. Alternatively, They might be married off to cement political alliances, which could offer some protection, but also meant separation from their mothers and entry into other potentially abusive situations. The physical health consequences of the concubine system were devastating and deliberately ignored by Mongol administrators, who viewed these young women as disposable resources. The combination of sexual violence, poor nutrition, inadequate shelter, and complete lack of medical care created conditions that would be recognized today as a public health catastrophe. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant in the Mongol court, spread by a system that encouraged multiple partners and provided no understanding of disease transmission. Young women who arrived healthy often quickly developed infections that caused chronic pain, infertility, and sometimes death. There were no treatments available, and the symptoms were often seen as evidence of moral failing rather than medical conditions requiring care. Pregnancy complications were common and frequently fatal. These were teenage girls whose bodies were often not yet fully mature, forced to bear children in an environment with no prenatal care, no understanding of nutrition during pregnancy, and no skilled medical assistance during childbirth. The maternal mortality rate among concubines was likely extremely high, though no records were kept of these deaths. Physical injuries from sexual violence and beatings were treated, if at all, with crude traditional remedies that often made conditions worse. Broken bones, internal injuries, and other trauma accumulated over time, leading to chronic pain and disability. The attitude of Mongol administrators toward these injuries was purely pragmatic. If a concubine could still perform her duties, her suffering was irrelevant. Mental health problems, which would have been nearly universal among the concubines, were not recognized as medical conditions. Depression, anxiety, and trauma responses were seen as character flaws or forms of resistance that needed to be punished rather than treated. Girls who showed signs of psychological distress were often subjected to additional abuse designed to break their spirits and force compliance. The malnutrition experienced by many concubines contributed to a host of health problems, including stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and reproductive complications. Food was used as a tool of control, with rations distributed based on compliance and favor rather than nutritional needs. Girls who displeased their supervisors might find themselves slowly starving, weakening them physically and making resistance even more difficult. The Mongol concubine system represented one of history's most extensive and systematic human trafficking operations. The economic calculations underlying this system reveal the cold pragmatism with which human beings were treated as commodities in the service of imperial power. The initial investment in acquiring concubines was substantial. Military campaigns to capture populations, the logistics of transportation across vast distances, the infrastructure needed to house and guard captives, all of these required significant resources. However, Mongol administrators calculated that the benefits justified these costs. Concubines served multiple economic functions. They provided sexual services, domestic labor, skilled craft work, and the potential to bear children who could serve the empire in the next generation. Different categories of concubines had different economic values. A young woman with literacy skills might be assigned to administrative duties, helping to manage the complex bureaucracy of the empire. One with musical abilities might be used for entertainment, impressing foreign dignitaries and demonstrating the Khan's cultural sophistication. Those with textile or craft skills could produce luxury goods that demonstrated imperial wealth and power. The reproductive capacity of concubines was calculated as a long-term economic asset. Children born to the Khan or his relatives represented potential heirs, military commanders, and administrative officials. Even children who didn't achieve high status could serve as soldiers, craftsmen, or lower level administrators. From the empire's perspective, each pregnancy represented an investment in future human resources. The use of concubines as diplomatic gifts created additional economic value by facilitating trade relationships and political alliances. A particularly beautiful or skilled woman given to a foreign ruler might help secure favorable terms for a commercial agreement or military alliance worth far more than the initial cost of acquiring and maintaining her. The psychological impact of the concubine system on conquered populations also served economic purposes. Communities that had witnessed the seizure of their daughters were more likely to comply with other imperial demands, understanding that resistance could lead to even greater losses. This compliance reduced the costs of governing conquered territories and made resource extraction more efficient. Despite the overwhelming odds and the systematic destruction of hope, some remarkable stories of resistance emerged from the Mongol concubine system. These accounts, preserved in fragmentary historical records and oral traditions, provide glimpses of the extraordinary courage displayed by some of these young women. One of the most documented cases involved a Chinese concubine known in historical records only as Lady Chen, captured during the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty. She managed to maintain secret contact with resistance fighters in her homeland. Over several years, she provided intelligence about Mongol military plans and court politics that helped organize guerrilla attacks against imperial forces. When her activities were discovered, she was subjected to prolonged torture but refused to reveal the identities of her contacts. Her execution was deliberately public and brutal, intended as a warning to other potential resistors. Another remarkable story involves a group of Central Asian concubines who managed to organize a coordinated escape attempt in the 1230s. Using their knowledge of the court's movement patterns and the assistance of sympathetic servants, they attempted to flee during a particularly chaotic period when the Khan's court was relocating. The Mongol concubine system didn't exist in isolation, but was part of a broader pattern of sexual slavery that characterized much of the medieval world. Understanding this context helps illustrate both the particular horrors of the Mongol system and the ways in which it reflected and amplified existing forms of exploitation. Similar systems existed in various forms throughout medieval Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The Byzantine Empire maintained harems of captured women. Islamic caliphates institutionalized concubinage through legal and religious frameworks. Viking raiders regularly captured women during their expeditions. What made the Mongol system distinctive was its scale, efficiency, and the vast distances across which it operated. The Mongols' systematic approach to human trafficking influenced practices in territories they conquered. Local elites learned to mimic Mongol methods, and the normalization of large-scale sexual slavery spread throughout regions under Mongol influence. This created a feedback loop where the demand for captive women increased, leading to more raids, more systematic exploitation, and the development of international networks dedicated to human trafficking. Trade routes that the Mongols established for commercial purposes also became conduits for human trafficking. The same infrastructure that moved silk, spices, and precious metals also moved captive women across continents. This integration of human trafficking with legitimate commerce made the system more efficient and harder to combat. The diplomatic protocols established by the Mongol Empire normalized the exchange of women as political gifts. Other medieval societies, seeking to maintain relationships with Mongol powers, adopted similar practices. This diplomatic legitimization of human trafficking had lasting impacts on international relations and contributed to the development of marriage diplomacy systems that treated women as commodities rather than individuals. The cultural exchanges facilitated by the Mongol Empire, while contributing to technological and artistic development, also spread knowledge about methods of controlling and exploiting captive populations. Techniques developed in one region for breaking the spirits of enslaved women were transmitted to other areas, making systems of exploitation more sophisticated and effective. The psychological impact of the Mongol concubine system extended far beyond its direct victims, creating patterns of trauma that influenced generations of people throughout the territories the empire controlled. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the immediate psychological consequences for the women involved and the broader cultural changes that resulted from the normalization of systematic sexual violence. For the direct victims, the psychological damage was comprehensive and often irreversible. These young women experienced what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma, the result of prolonged, repeated exposure to traumatic events with no possibility of escape. The symptoms included dissociation, emotional numbing, hypervigilance, chronic depression, and severe anxiety disorders. Many developed what would now be diagnosed as post traumatic stress disorder, though no such understanding existed at the time. The identity fragmentation experienced by these women was particularly severe. Forced to abandon their names, languages, cultures, and belief systems, while simultaneously being required to perform artificial identities designed to please their captors, many lost any coherent sense of who they were. This psychological shattering was often permanent, leaving survivors unable to form healthy relationships or maintain stable emotional states, even if they were eventually freed. The impact on family structures in conquered territories was equally devastating. Parents who had witnessed their daughters being taken often experienced survivor guilt, depression, and post traumatic stress that affected their relationships with their remaining children. Siblings grew up knowing that their sisters had been condemned to sexual slavery, creating family dynamics marked by grief, rage, and helplessness. Communities that had experienced mass seizures of young women developed collective trauma responses. Trust in authority figures collapsed. Traditional coming of age ceremonies and courtship rituals were abandoned because they made young women more visible and therefore more vulnerable to capture. Entire cultures modified their practices around the need to hide and protect their daughters. The children born from the concubine system often carried psychological wounds that influenced their own parenting and relationships. Many grew up with complex feelings about their mothers, simultaneously protective and ashamed, loving and resentful. These emotional conflicts were passed down to subsequent generations, creating intergenerational trauma patterns that persisted long after the Mongol Empire had collapsed. The decline of the Mongol concubine system was gradual and varied across different parts of the empire. As Mongol power fragmented in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, local rulers who had adopted similar practices sometimes maintained them, while others abandoned them as politically or economically unsustainable. The lack of centralized imperial authority meant that there was no systematic effort to address the consequences of the system or to provide support for its survivors. Many concubines who had spent years or decades in the system found themselves abandoned when political circumstances changed. They had been cut off from their original families and communities for so long that return was often impossible. Their children, whose status had depended on their father's power, sometimes found themselves vulnerable to revenge from populations that had suffered under Mongol rule. Some former concubines managed to establish independent lives, using skills they had acquired during their captivity to support themselves and their children. Others fell into poverty and prostitution, having no other means of survival in societies that offered few opportunities for women, especially those marked by association with former oppressors. The cultural knowledge that had been concentrated in Mongol courts was often lost when the system collapsed. Women who had served as repositories of linguistic, artistic, and technical knowledge from various conquered cultures took this information with them into exile, death, or obscurity. This represented a significant loss of human cultural heritage that paralleled the personal tragedies of the individual women involved. Historical records from the post Mongol period reveal attempts by some successor states to distance themselves from the concubine system while simultaneously maintaining many of its underlying structures. The use of enslaved women for sexual purposes continued in various forms, but the massive systematic approach pioneered by the Mongols was generally abandoned as politically and economically unsustainable. For centuries after the collapse of the Mongol Empire, the experiences of the women who had been enslaved in the concubine system remained largely unexamined by historians. Traditional historical narratives focused on military campaigns, political successions, and administrative achievements, while ignoring the human cost of imperial expansion. The voices of the victims were silenced not only during their lifetimes, but also in the historical record. Modern historical scholarship has begun to acknowledge and examine these previously ignored aspects of Mongol history, though significant gaps remain in our knowledge. Archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and careful re examination of existing historical sources have helped reconstruct aspects of the concubine system, but the personal experiences of individual women remain largely inaccessible. Contemporary efforts to understand and commemorate the victims of historical sexual slavery have sometimes included attention to the Mongol concubine system, though it has received less focus than more recent examples of systematic sexual exploitation. The scale and duration of the Mongol system, combined with the temporal distance from the present, have made it challenging to generate the kind of public awareness and recognition that might provide some form of historical justice. The patterns established by the Mongol concubine system can be seen in subsequent historical examples of systematic sexual slavery, from Ottoman devshirme practices to colonial exploitation to modern human trafficking. Understanding the historical precedents helps illuminate the continuities in how systematic sexual exploitation has been organized and justified across different historical periods. The Mongol concubine system offers profound and disturbing lessons about the capacity of human societies to normalize and systematize the most extreme forms of exploitation. The efficiency and scale of the system demonstrate how quickly brutal practices can become institutionalized when they serve the interests of those in power and when there are no effective mechanisms for accountability or resistance. One of the most important insights from studying this system is how it reveals the relationship between military conquest and sexual violence. The Mongol concubine system wasn't an accidental byproduct of warfare, it was an integral component of imperial strategy. The systematic collection of women served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the completeness of Mongol victory. It provided rewards for military service. It established ongoing symbols of domination, and it created economic and political relationships that reinforced imperial control. The bureaucratic efficiency of the system also offers troubling insights into how administrative competence can be deployed in service of human rights violations. The Mongols developed sophisticated methods for identifying, collecting, transporting, and managing human captives that required careful planning, resource allocation, and organizational coordination. This demonstrates that systematic human rights abuses often require not just cruel intentions, but also technical expertise and institutional capacity. The international scope of the concubine system illustrates how human trafficking can become integrated into broader economic and political networks. The same trade routes, diplomatic channels, and administrative structures that facilitated commerce and governance also enabled the movement of captive women across vast distances. This integration made the system more efficient, but also more difficult to combat as it became embedded in the normal functioning of international relationships. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological techniques used to control and exploit the concubines reveal sophisticated understanding of how to break human spirits and destroy resistance. The systematic erasure of identity, the creation of artificial dependencies, the fostering of competition among victims, and the use of psychological manipulation alongside physical violence. These methods have been replicated in various forms throughout history and continue to appear in contemporary human trafficking operations. The story of the Mongol concubines serves as a reminder that some of history's most celebrated achievements, the creation of vast empires, the facilitation of international trade, the development of efficient administrative systems, often rested on foundations of systematic human suffering. The Mongol Empire's remarkable expansion and organization required not just military prowess and political skill, but also the willingness to treat entire categories of people as expendable resources. The teenage girls who were torn from their families and communities to serve in Mongol courts represent thousands of individual tragedies that have been largely erased from historical memory. Their names are mostly unknown, their specific experiences unrecorded, their voices silenced by both their captors and by subsequent historians who found their stories inconvenient to acknowledge. Yet their experiences provide crucial insights into the human cost of empire building and the ways in which systematic exploitation can become normalized and institutionalized. The efficiency and scale of the Mongol concubine system reveals that large scale human rights violations don't just happen spontaneously, they require planning, resources, and the active cooperation of many people who convince themselves that they are serving higher purposes. The survival strategies developed by these young women, their psychological adaptations, their forms of resistance, their efforts to preserve their identities and protect each other, also represent remarkable testaments to human resilience. Even in the most extreme circumstances, people find ways to maintain their humanity and to resist the forces that seek to destroy their spirits. Understanding the Mongol concubine system in its full historical context helps illuminate the connections between past and present forms of exploitation. The same psychological techniques, organizational methods, and justifications that enabled the systematic enslavement of women in the 13th century continue to appear in contemporary human trafficking operations. The same international networks that facilitate legitimate commerce also provide infrastructure for moving captive people across borders. The same conflicts between individual conscience and institutional loyalty that prevented meaningful resistance to the Mongol system continue to enable modern forms of systematic abuse. As we conclude this examination of one of history's most systematic examples of sexual slavery, it's important to remember that behind every statistic, every administrative record, and every historical analysis were real human beings, teenage girls who had dreams, families, cultures, and futures that were violently destroyed in service of imperial ambition. These young women were not abstract victims of historical forces. They were individuals who experienced terror, pain, loss, and degradation on a scale that challenges our capacity for comprehension. They were also people who found ways to survive, to maintain relationships with each other, to preserve fragments of their original identities, and sometimes to resist the system that had enslaved them. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just as examples of historical cruelty, but as testimonies to human resilience and dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The fact that so few of their individual stories have been preserved makes it even more important to acknowledge their experiences and to understand the systematic nature of the violence they endured. The Mongol concubine system represents one of the largest and most organized examples of human trafficking in recorded history. Its victims numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn from dozens of different cultures, and transported across vast distances to serve the desires of their captors. The psychological, physical, and cultural damage inflicted on these women and their communities had consequences that extended far beyond their individual lives. By studying and acknowledging this history, we honor the memory of those who suffered and died in the service of others' power. We also better prepare ourselves to recognize and resist similar patterns of systematic exploitation that continue to appear in different forms throughout the world. The thunder of Mongol horses has long since faded from the steppes, but the lessons of what happened to the young women who were caught in the path of empire remain relevant to anyone seeking to understand how human societies can normalize the most extreme forms of cruelty, and how individuals can find ways to preserve their humanity even in the darkest circumstances. The girl hiding in her village, as the sound of approaching horses fills the air with dread, represents not just a historical moment, but a continuing human reality. In remembering her story and the stories of thousands like her, we bear witness to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. Their voices, silenced for centuries, deserve to be heard. Their suffering, ignored by those who celebrated the achievements of empire, deserves to be acknowledged. Their courage, displayed in the face of overwhelming oppression, deserves to be remembered.